it's interesting that in these times of so much, let's just put it that way, that we have the opportunity as conservationists to really impact the human aspect of what it is that we do. As Tim told you, I'm a professional wildlife biologist, ecologist. So I'm certified through the Wildlife Society and grew up in Edgefield, South Carolina, which is right across the river from Augusta, Georgia. But it's the furthest thing from the city of Augusta. I mean, I grew up in the middle of the woods on a family farm and on land that was likely part of a plantation where my ancestors were enslaved. So I have bitter ties to land and wildness, and I have sweet, sustaining ties to land and wildness that, for me, everything flows through birds mostly. Even though right now, just before, I was almost late because I was looking at a new kayak for to fish in. But this time right now is important because in many ways there have been some I would say surprising things that have happened, good for conservation. But then in ways, as we've encountered the worst of times, in many ways, there's an opportunity for us to do even better. And I always teach my students, I teach 2 classes at Clemson. I teach a conservation ornithology class, and I teach a wildlife policy class. I also teach some writing classes, but the 2 main classes are that policy class and that ornithology class. And I tell my students, that the biggest gains in conservation have always been made during the worst of times. Now, that can speak to 2 things. That can speak to the urgency of trying to save what's left that's been degraded, that's been depleted, and relatively few people recognize that. I think about the South Carolina Wildlife Federation, my home organization, which was, I believe, one of the first to be formed, and I'm always shocked that money was gathered, that people were giving dollars and $5. If you look at what a 1930-ish dollar was worth, people didn't have bread to eat, and people were giving money as the founders went door to door trying to figure out how to make conservation live in the state. And South Carolina has never been a wealthy state, well, at least mostly. But those worst of times resulted in some very good things happening. So I think we have those opportunities now to do some important things, because as we are isolated, as we are quarantined, as we are sort of in limbo in a number of ways, we have some attention being paid to us in different ways. So I got into the business, as I started to say, because I grew up in the country. I'm an introvert for the most part. I love talking to people, but then I quickly, after I'm off of a call or a meeting doing a talk, I'm quickly into some burrow. I'm quickly running away to try to find some spot in the woods to watch birds, or I ought to be in a deer stand this time of year, but it's been too hot for me for the most part. So it's given me an opportunity, as Tim said, to really focus in on a place where my work has sort of evolved to, and that's talking about land ethic and conservation ethic, but focusing down too on issues of inclusion, issues of broadening the conservation conversation to be more inclusive, to think about stakeholder. And as we all look at maps these days, we ought to be thinking, we ought to be burrowing down to county level. We ought to be burrowing down, not just to county level though, but to neighborhoods and who we can reach that's different than the crowd that we've been preaching to really for all this time, which has been, let's face it, a pretty homogenized crowd, right? For me, I go to most meetings. All the years I was going to the National Wildlife Federation for a few years, I saw a guy, one of the people in charge, look like me, right? And that heartened me. I said, wow, this is an organization that's recognizing that it's important to expand. Jerome Ringo is up there. I'd see a couple of other Black folks, including some folks from South Carolina Wildlife Federation, but it seemed stagnant to me. And it seemed in some ways that it was, in retrospect, it seemed in some ways that once there was a little bit of coffee in the cream, that everybody was okay with that. That they were like, oh, we don't really want that much more coffee in this cream, because then that might be coffee we don't like. So, that's one of the issues I started trying to address. I was on the board for South Carolina Wildlife Federation and the national rep. I counted 11 years, the affiliate rep. I was on the Audubon South Carolina board for 14 years, board chairperson for 3 years. I've been on National Audubon Society board, which I resigned from, and perfectly willing to talk about why I did that. And I was on that board for about 2.5 years, board of Aldo Leopold Foundation, board of Bird Note, and have turned down several boards since then. And part of the reason that I turned those boards down or got off all these boards was that in many ways things weren't changing. The boards were stagnant. Again, I was a drop of coffee in the cream, and people seemed sort of satisfied with that. Or they looked at me and said, why don't you get more coffee and add it to this cream? And that wasn't my job. I was reading a letter that Tim sent me earlier, and I haven't pulled it up, but it was, I think, from a woman named Maria. And what caught me was the full context of the letter, but at the bottom of the letter, it said, essentially, Black folks who work in your organization are probably very tired. We've been undergoing these different stresses that many people are unaware of. But one of the stresses is that people look at us and they say, oh, can you solve this problem? And I'm perfectly willing to work with people. But one of my new mantras, and I got about 70 mantras now, I counted last night. One of my new mantras, y'all, is you can't have silver bullet expectations with silver plated intentions. You can't have silver bullet expectations with silver plated intentions. And one of the reasons that I agreed to talk to y'all this morning and to talk to Tim is that Tim has been in this conversation long before this past year. When we first met, and Richard Moog, is Richard on the call?
No, he's not on the board anymore. He's in fishing retirement.
Okay, all right, there you go. Well, smart man. But we would have these conversations, and they didn't talk around the issues. They were straightforward, what I call palms up. And when you go palms up, that says that I'm coming to you so that you can see the agenda that I have in my hands. You can see that I'm unarmed, right? That I'm coming to you in a certain way. And so I would watch what North Carolina Wildlife Federation did, and I would say, man, I'd go to our director, Ben, and I'd say, man, why can't we do what they're doing? They're doing some pretty amazing stuff up across the border. Let's try that. And we usually didn't try it for one reason or another. So I like to look at intention. And North Carolina Wildlife Federation has had more than silver-plated intentions. They run deeper than the silver plating, I think, than I've seen in most organizations, including nationally, at the largest level. So that's part of my jumbled story. And now the conversations that I like to have with people are those hands open, no holds barred, ask me any question you want to question, query, and I'll respond. And I always promise 100% response, even if it's a shoulder shrug or a raised eyebrow. Because I obviously don't have all the answers, but I think it's important to respond. And again, I want to thank Tim for his persistence, because with what has happened in the last few months with COVID, with politics, with racial injustice, a lot of people suddenly became interested in inclusion and diversity. And it wasn't a sudden interest with the wildlife, with North Carolina. It's something that I know has been addressed for a while, and I know it's created some discomfort. Again, I'll tell you, I've been at national board tables where people have gotten up and walked out. I've been in organizations where we got a new executive director who is really, really interested in the issues of inclusion and diversity, and within 6 months, he was gone. Because people were just uncomfortable with it. They just didn't. And I think they thought because they had a Black board member that they had done enough. But meanwhile, really the people that they should have been speaking to on the ground, who only practice catch and release fishing into a cast iron pan of grease, can't afford to let fish go because they got to eat them. The people who are watching birds, but not with the intent of putting them on lists, but with the intent of understanding where the other fish are so they can catch dinner. People who never mention sea level rise, but can't drink their water because of salt, because of seawater intrusion, because they're not catching what they used to catch, but they're not saying climate change because it sounds too big. It sounds too, frankly, blue. Waterfowlers who are saying, man, we're not getting flights down until late. These ducks are staying way up. Ask anybody who knows Stuttgart, Arkansas, and that place has suffered for quite a few years because ducks are staying up in South Dakota. And in the blind, people are saying things are changing, but then they don't vote like it. So, I think the issues are writ large, and part of what we have to do as conservationists is see inclusion, diversity, engagement. We have to see all those things as action items, and we can't silo them. They can't be things that you think about when, unfortunately, only think about when somebody gets murdered in the streets. You can't just think about them when it comes time to think about them. They have to be things that you wake up thinking about, you go to bed thinking about, and that become part of your mission. And that's part of what I've been seeing here. I will tell you, Tim is one of the, he's sort of like, when I grew up, the fish that I used to catch more than anything was a hornhead chub. And, but you'd only catch that hornhead chub after it had stolen your bait like 60 times off your hook. And Tim keeps coming back to the hook. Right. And so he didn't let me alone about this. And I'm glad he didn't. He would call and he'd say, I want to talk about this. And this was years ago. He'd say, can you come and talk to us about this? Can we have a discussion about it? And the schedule never worked out until now. So I see this as a silver lining in the COVID cloud and an opportunity for us to have some good, candid conversation about this. So the floor is always open. Anybody who has a comment or question or, I'm happy to entertain that going forward.
Drew, this is Tim, and again, really thankful that you are joining us, and to the board, and then secondarily any staff that are on here. take this opportunity, as Drew said, no holds barred. You got you got the real deal here. So I am now turning it over to John to formally open the floor for a open conversation with somebody who's got experience and has something to say. Go ahead, John.
Well, Drew, one, thank you so much for coming today or visiting with us today. It's a little different dialogue when you're not in person. So we really do appreciate it. And it's fun to hear about some of your experiences. And I'll sort of kick it off, Drew. Tell me, what types of things are organizations doing that are being successful in sort of expanding the tent and growing their base in a more diverse fashion? I mean, what traits or characteristics or things are they doing that help evidence, and create that success?
Great question, John. I like to, a lot of the organizations I talk to, because I'm an ornithologist and a bird watcher, I speak a lot in metaphor and allegory. So as a writer, so what I tell people, John, is I tell these birding organizations, I say, you know what, you got to take your binoculars down sometimes to see the wider field of view. And from an organizational message, that means that you have to first of all, look at your mission statement. And not only should you have a mission statement, you should have a vision statement. And that mission and that vision got to reflect some sort of organizational Myers-Briggs. Now, one of the things that I do is when I look at organizations, I sort of try to get a feel for what their Myers-Briggs is. And if you're sitting around a table and now don't get me wrong, I like money. But if I'm sitting between a multi-millionaire and a nearly billionaire, whose designs are really to sort of just leverage him, her, or their self monetarily, and they're only on that board because of that, and the contributions are important. But when I see that, I begin to ask the questions of what's the intent of the board, and then how does it feed into the function of the organization? And then I sort of watch who squirms when certain questions are asked. And it's not that I'm looking for no squirming. I think an organization, John, has to be willing to be uncomfortable. It has to be willing to face uncomfortable situations, because you only grow in discomfort. Growing up as a boy, I had this thing called Osgood Slotters, which my knees hurt like hell, but it was my growth plates. It was my legs growing at a rate that was actually painful. If you are cruising along the same way you have always cruised along for decades, and you haven't experienced any growing pains, you need to check yourself. So I look at those organizations who are willing to be in discomfort, and I'll go ahead and put it out there. One of the organizations I used to serve on the board of that was doing that was way out in Seattle, and it was BirdNote. And BirdNote, a lot of people don't know them. You'll hear their stuff on a lot of public radio stations. They do these little vignettes about birds and bird conservation. But it's a relatively small organization with a pretty narrowly focused mission initially to connect people with, but who saw that they needed to or want to expand their audience. So when they produced, the Birding While Black video, there was a lot of pushback, but they were willing to be uncomfortable, and they were small enough to be uncomfortable. They were agile enough to sort of thumb their nose at larger organizations and say, well, this is us, and we're not paying fealty to a larger national organization. Now, part of what I saw when I was with the Federation, with a certain director, when affiliates started saying, you know what, we're going to peel away from this, because literally the presentations that you're giving, your grandchildren aren't getting any older, and the tears seem like crocodile tears to me. And and they weren't paying enough attention to what the affiliates were doing. Tim mentioned that I was often on this, on these committees, resolutions committees. And I remember the day that somebody from DC came and told me what I needed to say. That didn't go well. And because DC became a place where they had an agenda that was bigger than the affiliate agenda. Now, everybody can come together towards a common cause, but if you're saying we can't say hunting because people are going to be offended in, I don't know, wherever, then there's an issue. So I say that again to say that organizations have to be willing to be uncomfortable. They have to be small enough to be agile. And when I say small, that means that in mission and vision have to be big, but ultimately you have to say, you know what? I'm next to this community in Raleigh or Wilmington or Boone or wherever it is I am in North Carolina. How does what I do filter down to these people and not just the folks around the board table? Part of the reason I left Audubon was it's a large organization that's doing some good things. But as a board member, I couldn't justify going to Columbia, South America for a board meeting. That didn't make sense to me. When you have state chapters that want and need attention. So my thing was, I'm thinking in my head, well, you should be going to these state chapters on a rotating basis to sort of commune with them. So that's a huge organization, and that's going to be a difficult way to change it's going to be difficult to change the direction. You can't change direction with photo ops. You can't change direction again by really just throwing money at it. Money has to be part of it, but people have to see your palms up, and they have to say, you know what? They've been doing this for a while, and I know that they're not just coming to me this week, but they're going to be here next week and the week after and the year after that. And I can count on this organization to not come to me just to take. And when I see that and I hear that, and it takes a while to learn what it is, John, but when there's fresh fish in the well and when there's not, and you pay attention to that smell. So, for me, those organizations, part of the reason, again, that I've always looked at North Carolina was Tim's and Richard's willingness to come forward early. And I'll say the person who facilitated a lot of that was Dave Hargett. And Dave Hargett has always told it like it is. He's always dealt with uncomfortable circumstances, and I can respect him for that. And I can respect him and Richard in the same way organizationally. So, I would see what they were doing, what y'all are doing organizationally. And I know it's not perfect, but I would be thinking to myself, man, why aren't we doing that in Columbia? Why aren't we, let's team up with North Carolina Wildlife Federation and figure out how they get stuff done. Let's figure out how to put our binoculars down, to see more broadly. Let's figure out, you know, I mean, yeah, it's cool to go and fish for that single big fish, you know, and slip it back in the water when, you know, it exceeds the slot limit or whatever. But sometimes the best way to catch fish is to chum where legal. You know, so, you know, you're out on that big boat offshore. If you just drop a line in the water and are trolling, that's one thing. And I think a lot of organizations troll. They don't chum. And you got to figure out how to chum. And chumming means that you got to figure out what the people around you want, what they need, and how you put that out there. And that's an important concept. And I watch organizations who do it and struggle and grow. And then I watch organizations who think about it, talk about it, but never do it and stay what they are. So that's a lot, I know, but it's, you know, I've been trying to figure out how to get organizations to tell who they are from sort of this organizational Myers-Briggs perspective. Because some of them, quite frankly, some of them, and I found this out during Black Birders Week, some of them are really not interested in being anyone other than who they currently are. They have no interest in expanding. No, zero. And they made it clear. And who was it? Maya Angelou said, you know, when people show you who they are the first time, believe them. Well, I believe them. And I let them alone, and I go to the organizations and support the organizations that are showing a willingness to change and be uncomfortable. So does any of that make sense, or is it just all the jumble mess of metaphor?
No, that's very helpful and insightful. I tell you, Drew, it's you know, for me, it has real emotional strings to it. So it's really helpful to hear you say all this. What about other folks? Other folks have questions?
Hey, Drew, if I could ask a question. This is Stacy Nelson.
Yeah.
So just along those same lines, you know, we know that if we love our natural resources and we care about the environment, the water just can't be carried only by those with privilege to have a voice. So whether it's privilege through education, finances, exposure, background, it has to be more inclusive that raises the voice of those who have historically been left out. Do you have, I mean, what are your thoughts on increasing opportunities to ensure that we're being more intentional about how we include those that have been missing?
Great question, Stacy. Again, so I said I had 70 mantras. One of the first is same air, same water, same soil, same earth, same fate. And the corollary to that is we're all upstream of somebody else, but we're also downstream of somebody. And, you know, if you're downstream of a polluter, you're going to be, you know, besides not being able to get clean water to drink or bathe in, or you're also going to be stressed, and you ought to be angry that person who has, in part, your existence in their hands does not care enough about you to clean their act up. Now, meanwhile, as that water runs through your hands, what do? Do you try to clean it up so that the people who are downstream of you are better off than you are? So, Stacy, I think that part of that intentionality revolves around a word that keeps circulating, but it's hard to grasp. It's called empathy. And that's such a hard word to get a hold of, but often as conservation professionals, you don't hear people use the word love. You don't hear people use the word empathy. You don't hear them use the word care. They figure it's too soft. And everything is couched in terms of wildness and faraway places, and not in terms of love and care and justice and share. Conservation, to me, the sort of the synonym, the phrase that I would use is love and share and care. So in those ways, to be intentional, man, I can't, I got to go back to my base and my grandmother, who, the first thing that she told me was, you got to treat others as you want to be treated. And no one wants to have their lives dictated to. And that's what conservation often has tended to do. Those with privilege who could afford to go to faraway wild places would talk about them, and then would come back and say, well, I want this for me. I want this place with very few people except for when I can get to it. I don't want you to keep any fish except these kinds of fish so I can catch bigger fish. I don't want you to kill any deer except these deer with this antler size so I can have these antlers, bigger antlers to put on my wall. If we think about a lot of where we are from a conservation standpoint, it stands sort of as an exclusionary kind of thing. And I'm not saying I don't like to kill big deer. I'm not saying I don't want to catch a big spot. But what I'm saying is that you got to think about those people, again, who aren't catching and releasing, who are dependent upon the resource for dinner. You've got to think about the intentionality of sustaining the resource for more than your objective. So again, Stacy, I would go back to mission and vision. I would go back to look for exclusionary phrases and terms and those kinds of things. I can tell you now that, for example, Sierra Club, Wilderness Society, they're dealing with issues of the definition of a 4-letter word, wild, right? Now, you add 4 more letters to that word and you've got wildness. But then if you stick 2 letters in the middle of wild and ness, you stick E and R, wilderness becomes a very exclusionary term. That means far away, exclusive. You better have on Patagonia or something else to go in there. And I think, some of these companies are beginning to understand that. They're beginning to understand that in order to be intentional, for example, you can't just sell people $300 vests. They're understanding that you have to invest in communities, and you can no longer just talk to the same people who are spending the same dollars in the same silo. So, the intentionality comes from thinking outside of yourself. And conservation, Aldo Leopold talked about it. I think if Leopold had lived another 10 years, that this was a man that was going towards talking about social construct. And Leopold's argument was that land ethic had to be something that was not written in stone. It wasn't just what he wrote in a Sand County Almanac, but it was determined by where you are, your circumstance, but ultimately, in the end, you ought to want to do right by the natural world and your fellow human being. And I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, right? So if we're sharing the same air, the same water, the same soil, the same earth, and ultimately the same fate, the sea level rise might get to people in Wilmington before it gets to them in Raleigh, but you better be damn sure people in Raleigh gonna feel it eventually. And folks are gonna say, why weren't we paying attention to this 10 years ago? Well, so now what you're doing as a federation, part of it is to let people see, and not in any sort of gratuitous way, but people can't see your logo coming and run from it. And I can tell you that there are conservation organizations that when they show up, this is written down, people said it may as well have been the Klan coming, because I knew they were coming to take stuff from me. So you don't want to get to that point. You want to be at a point where people see you as more than just those people who hunt and fish or bird watch. They care about me as much as they care about warblers or white-tailed deer. And that's an intentional, personal thing. And, as you build your board or, you look to be more inclusive in a board, those are the kinds of individuals that you try to sustain and that you let people know, you know what, I'm not expecting, as a board member, I'm not expect necessarily, if you can give $5,000 a year or 20, whatever, you can do that. But I'm also asking you to give of your time and your talent and your voice. And not enough organizations value that. When I first started coming onto these boards and they said, oh, by the way, we expect X number of dollars a year. And I was young in my career. I had 2 young children, all that sort of stuff. And I said, well, you know what? For a while I tried it and I stressed myself out financially and trying to do that. And then one day I got up the chutzpah and I went and I said, you know what? Tell you what, I'm going to bill you at my consulting ecologist rate of $200 an hour to be on your board. I want you to figure out how to write off my expenses. And then that conversation changed, because what I was saying was, this is a barter. I'm giving time to you. And if I'm spending 4 hours coming down there and 4 hours back, that's 8 hours on the road. Then I'm spending time in the board meetings. I'm spending time on the phone. And I told him, I said, now, if I'm billing you as an ecologist, it's going to look like a bill that's coming from an attorney. Because if I talk to you for a minute, you're going to get billed for an hour. And then people begin to think, oh, well, maybe I need to value you in a different way. That's an intentional thing. So be intentional about valuation, be intentional about sharing, be intentional about how you see the world as an organization. And that all starts with how, individuals and leadership see.
Drew, my name's John Robbins. A related question to Stacy's, moving on from what organizations, nonprofits need to do as a society, as governance, as nonprofits helping out, is the issue of having people of color feel more comfortable in the outdoors. As an old white guy, I've just never had to face the issues and challenges that a person of color may have, be it a national park, a state park, wildlife refuge, or just a city park, a greenway. What thoughts do you have about what needs to be done to make people of color more comfortable, feel less threatened, to have those environments be more welcoming and even more safe for people of color to want to be outdoors more and to begin to learn more and participate?
Thank you for that question. Is it John?
Yes, John.
Thank
Robin.
you, John.
Yes, sir.
Well, first off, people of color are in the outdoors now.
Mm-hmm.
Now they may be. So here's a little story. Down the low country of South Carolina, and I know in y'all's coastal plain, I know in both places it's come under stress, but dog hunting is important. Deer dogs are important. And I have a friend who works for a paper company, unnamed, but he's at a high level. But he was, his enslaved ancestors were on the land that eventually he now lives on, but also where his hunt club was. And that hunt club was 100% black. 100%. Had a video, just a beautiful video of them on a Saturday after the hunt, you know, and everybody, you brag more on your dogs than you do on the deer that you kill. But what's happened to that, and this is right outside of Charleston in a place called Clubhouse. And what's happened to that hunt club at Clubhouse, it's now 80% white. And it's 80% white because of gentrification. And that's a policy issue where people, as things change, people lose their land, they lose access. And it's not that they weren't there, but suddenly they can't afford to be there. So, you know, you're looking at a tax base that's changed in some places, and places where people used to be comfortable going, or they used to even own, they can't operate. So, you know, one of the organizations that helps things like that is in South Carolina, it's called the Center for Heirs Property Preservation. And they give pro bono legal help and advice to primarily rural Black landowners to help them keep their land, to help them establish clear title to it. And then people can keep that legacy going. So that's one aspect. The next aspect, John, I think is that white folks have to recognize the history of public land. I know in North Carolina, you know, there were segregated beaches. In South Carolina, the Black Beach in South Carolina was almost in North Carolina. It's up at North Myrtle Beach. That was the Black Beach in South Carolina. My family and I, we vacationed down at Edisto, have been for a long, long time. But when the order to desegregate in the late 60s came, rather than open, Edisto, and I'm sure places in North Carolina did it, they closed for 2 years. But nobody ever talks about that. And Black folks remember that. You know, because, you know, our parents or our grandparents were witness to some of that. And when you just pretend like it never happened, like folks who I take bird watching in the low country down here, who want to be offended because I tell them all those rice fields were created by enslaved Black people. Well, I mean, that's an issue that we can solve by education. So acknowledging what has happened in the past, that there is a reason for the discomfort, and that suddenly people aren't going to be necessarily comfortable where they are, just because we want them to be. So, you know, one of the workshops that we've had for landowners, for primarily Black landowners, and most of them were older women. So let me ask you guys this. Why would I not have that workshop in June in the Piney Woods to talk about holding on to your land, to talk about ways to manage for wildlife and timber? Anybody want to guess? One word. Well, a lot of those women can deal with bugs, but they don't want to deal with snakes. So we had the workshop in February. And you know, and I'm not trying to make that into a big racial thing, but I'm saying, you know, a lot of times organizations will say, oh, come out with us here to this place that we love so you can enjoy nature and we can show you how much we want to welcome you to this place. Well, you know, that old phrase of meeting people where they are, psychologically, just a little bit of thought saying, you know what, a 65 or 70-year-old Black woman does not want to be out in a place with snakes that are as long as she is tall. So we designed that workshop for a cold month when we could be pretty much assured that they weren't going to come across crawling snakes. And we ended up with like 30 women in that workshop under tall pines, talking about red cockaded woodpeckers, prescribed fire, thinning. And you know what? Those women continued to go to some of those workshops. So, John, you know, getting people comfortable is sometimes going where they're already comfortable. instead of taking them to a national park somewhere far away, find out where they want to go. And then that's a palms up move. So, my wife had to tell me some of this, and it wasn't even a black, white, brown, red, green thing. She went on one of my birding classes, and I had all these people. We were all excited walking around this island all morning. And we took a slight break for lunch, and she came up to me and she said, "What was that?" And I'm like, "That was how I work, and don't you see how happy people are?" She said, "Yeah, but I also know a lot of people want to pee. And you might be able to go behind a tree and pee, but these little old ladies that you got in this bird group, did you figure out where they were going to go to the bathroom before you decided to keep them out without a break for 4 hours?" And I was like, duh, no. So that taught me, and sensitivity is not, it transcends race. It transcends color. So I had in my mind to think about then a 70-year-old woman who was not going to be comfortable with going behind a tree, who might need breaks every hour or hour and a half, as opposed to me pushing people to count every bird they could see for the next 4 hours. And in doing that, that is meeting people where they are. And John, that practice of it is sometimes just sitting back and slowing down. And I wasn't thinking about basic biology. Now I think about it more now because I'm older and my bladder is smaller and weaker. And so I make sure there are breaks built in. And I not only have to think about life as a 55-year-old man, I need, if I've got, an 80-year-old person in my workshop, I got to think, do I go off trail here with somebody who just had a hip replacement a year ago? So if you think about those things that don't cause you to see color first, and then let your mind go to a place where, okay, I'm not gonna, I might not take people, and I've been in these situations where I've been with a bird group and nobody else notices the Confederate flag but me. And I'm like, did y'all see that? And people will say, what was it? And I'll say, y'all didn't see that big old stars and bars flying at that house where y'all wanted to stop and look at the bird feeder? I said, I'm not stopping there. And so in that moment of educating others about what I might be sensitive to, those people listened. And then they began to see the world sort of in a different light. And it didn't have to be a big historical discussion. It's sort of like being careful with words. I've been in groups where people would be joking around and they would say, "Oh, they just ought to hang him by the neck till dead. Can you believe he said that?" And I'm like, well, or they talk about meeting at the hanging tree. Why are we going to meet at the hanging tree? I'm not going to meet there. Or why don't we go into the Hiawassee Valley to look at golden wing warblers? Well, where are we going in the Hiawassee Valley? Or somebody asking me why I don't go this place or that place. I mean, I got places right across the border in North Carolina that I don't want to go. So you have to be, you just ask those questions, John. And, but one of the things that somebody did the other day to me that made me feel more comfortable, I'm sitting right here in my little space, took a phone call from an editor, and this editor said to me, she said, "Drew, I know we're going to be talking about this thing you're doing for us, but I want you to know, as a white woman, I may say some things as we talk about race that are going to be uncomfortable. They're uncomfortable for me. But I want to let you know that I understand that this may be a hard conversation. I went forward into that conversation with her astounded, because it was like a land acknowledgement. And I don't know if they do it in North Carolina or not, but when I have conversations with people mostly in Canada or the Pacific Northwest, before they talk, they give honor to the indigenous peoples, the First Nations, who were on the land before they were. And what I've begun to try to do is to give that space for indigenous peoples, enslaved peoples, and for the losses that we have currently experienced in this pandemic. Because I don't want people in any conversation thinking that we're just going to go forward to talk about whatever wild animal it is without understanding it's a real world out there. So, John, again, it's a long answer, but it is all about, for individuals and comfort, understanding what comfort zones are. And those comfort zones frequently require listening first, but then they also require stepping out of self. So again, my bathroom example, and I had to have a woman tell me that. Y'all need to take more breaks. And I started doing it. And it made a difference to and then other women came forward later and said, thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing that. Because, I had to go 2 hours ago and you wouldn't stop. But now on this workshop, it seems like you have thought about us in a way that's important to us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome. Did I see Bob? Did you have a question, Bob Brown?
In a way, Drew, because I was in academics for 40 years, and that's not quite the same as an NGO, but close. And whether it was in Kingsville, Texas, or department head at Mississippi State, or A&M, or dean here, we struggled to try and recruit minority students, minority faculty and staff. At one time, recruiting women was a challenge. It's not anymore. Half or more of all the wildlife students and ecology students are women, and certainly a lot now and have moved into the profession at various levels. I do think that the challenge is for a group of primarily white Anglo-Saxon board members, mostly, can set policy, that's fine, but we can't actually do the recruiting. I remember when I was at Texas A&M, and at the time we had problems recruiting Hispanic students. And when I hired Roel Lopez, I'm sure you know Roel. Oh yeah. All of a sudden we had a dozen Hispanic graduate students, just bingo. And all of a sudden that he had more Hispanic students than any department at A&M had. And so that was great. And again, maybe a little easier in Texas recruiting Hispanics. But here at NC State, I had 2 full-time African-American diversity staff. And no matter how hard they tried, it was just a marginal success rate. And of course, as you've mentioned, and I know Stacy knows this, when you become the chocolate drop in the cream, you get worked to death. They want you to be on every committee. You're the token minority on everything. And it just, and actually to the extent that the department heads, I've had to coach department heads and myself as dean, be careful with that, or this person isn't going to get promoted because they're not publishing and teaching. They're doing all this committee stuff. Right. And so, well, where I'm going with this, and maybe I'm getting ahead for what our board needs to discuss at some later point, is it's looking to me like we may either have to increase our board to to have more minority interaction, and or hire people, minority staff who can go out and talk to and relate to the type of people you're talking about, the hunters and the subsistence hunters and fishers, the folks that maybe want to take their family to a park and haven't thought beyond that sort of thing. But as a white Anglo-Saxon, they won't relate to me. I can't do that. We need to have people like you do that sort of thing, but people like you are already swamped with expectations. I guess that's where I am with it.
Well,
Yeah.
well, Bob, it's interesting because, man, I got a lot of friends in Texas, and one of I remember the issue down in South Texas with parks, and Maria solved the problem because she wasn't getting Latinx visitation, right? And she said she would see people, she would see families, but they wouldn't stay. It was a retention issue, really. People would come, but they wouldn't stay. And now I think this is widely recognized and maybe even published. Can anybody guess what Maria did to increase visitation and daily retention at those parks?
Spanish signs, Spanish language signs.
Nope.
Nope.
She increased the size of the picnic tables. She pulled picnic tables together so they no longer just sat a typical WASP family of 4 or 6. She pulled tables together so that 8 or 12 people could gather there. And that was a sort of recruitment. Part of what we suffer as a profession, Bob, is people think conservation means conservative, and that you always do things the same way. And they also want to silo these issues into human dimensions. And you and I both know at a lot of meetings, professional meetings, human dimensions has become more and more popular. But I would argue that every aspect, really, managing for the most endangered species in the world is easier than managing human beings. So, it can't be, this situation where we're trying to figure out how to get people in. I would argue that we have to go out. And academia has a particular problem of being sort of insular in ways that an NGO ought not have. So, if you have a chance, if the NGO has a chance to go to a fish fry at a black church, go. If you if you have a chance as a WASP or a white person of whatever creed to be a minority, do it. And feel what it's like to be the drop of cream in the black coffee, right? And that begins, what that does is it begins to give you some credibility. I have a friend who, she's now in Washington State, college peer, faculty member, who was working with the Eastern Band of Cherokee here in Western North Carolina or close to here. And Karen was trying to get some, to collect some data on indigenous use of certain plants as botanicals and so forth. It took her 3 years, she told me, and her, where she knew she was accepted was she got invited into somebody's house for fry bread. It took 3 years before she got invited in. But guess what? She only had funding for 4 years. So those people were not operating on her funding cycle, which is what we run into in academia. 2-4 years, unless we've got some long-term kind of study. And And so part of what we can do, I think, as NGOs, as recruiting and bringing people in, is to understand that maybe what we are looking for is engagement, and that's different than membership. Don't worry about membership yet. Don't worry about seeing those names on the rolls. Don't worry about people paying their $25 a year yet. As a matter of fact, you know, I saw this statistic one time. The number of people who have that green head sticker on their vehicles for DU is not, a lot of those people are not members. Okay. So what's important to you ought to be in part branding. And that people are willing to put your name in a place next to theirs. And that's not, doesn't always mean membership. So, you know, I had Bob, man, you know, all of the, I think it's 4 of the Black PhDs that graduated to this point in forestry and environmental conservation, I advised. And that kind of, I'm not sure whether that meant that other people weren't recruiting those students. I don't know what that means, but you know, there were certainly, here I am working with birds and Black land ethic and sometimes small mammals and herpetofauna. But other people were doing this work too. You know, we have a Hispanic woman who is in our department, and I know she's had issues and trouble getting people into the department. So what I began to do then is I began to look out and I say, okay, so what culturally in our organizational Myers-Briggs, Gestalt, whatever, makes people pause? Well, one of the things early on that made people pause is that I'm a wildlifer, so I wasn't involved with the forestry club, but I was looking at a forestry club Facebook page one day, and they were at Conclave, Forestry Conclave. And not only there were Confederate flags all over the place. The Clemson flag had been changed so that the stars were paws. But over all these conclave encampments, there were flags. And I'm thinking to myself, how does any Black person especially, and there were a few. I've talked to some of the Black foresters about this, and they said, you know, that was a real issue with us. And then finally somebody brought it up. So one of the things, Bob, and to the rest of the folks, you know, that whole Homeland Security thing is what? Or when we used to fly in airports, that thing was see something, say something. See something, hear something, sense something, say something, do something. So take that extension further. And, you know, Bob, as a dean, I'll tell you, one of the biggest turning points in my career was I had a dean. And that dean, who wasn't at the university very long, but I remember I was a couple of years out from promotion and tenure, from assistant to associate. And I was on all these search committees. I was on all these diversity and inclusion committees. And he called me in during an evaluation. And he looked me in the face. He put my stuff aside. I'd had an okay year publishing. But he said, you know what? He said, I know why you're doing all this. He said, but this is going to cost you your academic career if you don't push back. And Bob, I was insulted at first. You know what I actually did? I actually tried to, in my mind, my first thought was, well, this guy's racist. And within about a month, I understood. I was on 8 search committees.
Oh.
And I go back now and I don't know where he is, but I would thank him, this white man. I would thank him now for saving my academic life. And then as the dean, he put pressure on the chairs and the committee heads and said, you know what, y'all got to look harder. You know, you can't keep stressing him out that way. So don't be afraid to go outside of the organization, outside of NCWF, to ask advice, not just mine, but anybody else, you know. And what I'll do, you know, I remember when Thomas Easley was at NC State, and Thomas is where now? Yale, I think.
Yeah, he's at Yale.
You know, and but you know, Thomas and I used to talk, and you know, and you ask about who's this resource or that resource. Well, if you ask me, I'll give you other resources. You know, I'll give you Keenan Adams with the Fish and Wildlife Service, a former PhD student of mine. I'll give you Marla Hamilton, who is now one of the chiefs of biosurvey with the Park Service. They'll give you their advice. Keenan, as a matter of fact, he's stationed in Puerto Rico now, but he's in charge. He's on the hiring panel for Fish and Wildlife Service. I call him U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Jesus, because he can touch water and make it into wine. But these are, you know, and so those are use your resources as networks, and one person leverages to the next. It's just like, you know, all of us are 6 degrees. I'm sure it's somebody in there on the board who could get in touch with God knows who today in a matter of minutes if they needed to. So think outside organizationally, think outside of some of who the people are. I'll tell you an organization that really sort of personifies now for me that agile, small, sort of disconnected and formally from the large organization, Georgia Audubon, that used to be Atlanta Audubon. They just hired Corrine Newsom as a community outreach coordinator. Alabama Audubon, that's disconnected from nationals. Alabama Audubon hired somebody to do nothing but work in the Alabama Black Belt. You know, and they put out a national search. It was very competitive. You know, so yeah, Corinne is not going to be able to do everything. Some of you might recognize her name from Black Birders Week. I mean, her face has been all over the place. But those people are out there. And as to Bob's point, putting your money where your mouth is and dedicating a well-paid position and not something that's going to be siloed away. I can tell you, I've also watched national organizations hire people and then isolate them. And they don't last. So make this whole thing a part of your core mission. I think, quite frankly, that's part of our problem here at Clemson in our department, is that it's always been this sort of side thing. And the university dropped all of its dollars for supporting grad students of color, which is one way. All that money went away. Well, it went away federally. But I know that, I mean, paper companies got money. Ducks Unlimited is swimming in money. Why aren't these organizations supporting fellowships and scholarships? And last story here, going back to Texas, I'm on a committee with Rick Comiskey, the Northwood committee, where we're talking about some of these issues. And we were having a conversation with some waterfowl biologists in Mexico, talking about, in Central America, talking about how to expand our reach. And all these brains, almost all of us academics, here we are talking about all this stuff and Hispanic serving universities, blah, blah, blah. And somebody says, well, you know, how can we get Mexico more involved in what we're doing, blah, blah, blah. How can we get our students more involved? And the Mexican biologist said, well, because the question of curriculum and language came up. And the Mexican biologist said, well, you know, most of most of the people that we have coming out of our internships, they're functional in English. Are your wildlife students functional in Spanish in some way? No. And suddenly the whole conversation switched, because it wasn't about what Mexico could do to make things more inclusive. It became what North American, well, what United States, what land grants primarily in the United States could do to make white students primarily better equipped to travel internationally, to talk about blue-winged teal or whatever. The same problem exists up in French Canada. A lot of those French Canadian students don't speak English, and they're in the midst of a duck factory. So so we got to figure out where sort of our where our Venn diagrams intersect, and then work to expand those. But it means oftentimes going outside of your own circle to understand where that diagram intersects. I saw there was a hand raised from, I think
Bonnie?
it was Bonnie. Is Bonnie still there?
Drew, yeah, I'm right here, and thank you so much. This has been so enlightening. As I was listening to you speak, all of a sudden I'm like, a podcast. I heard this man on a podcast, and it was the Prairie Warbler on This Is Love, and I highly recommend all of you to go listen to it. It's beautifully articulated, and you really, in a most beautiful way, express some of the challenges, but also for the love of what you do. So that was on This Is Love, and it's actually out of Raleigh, Durham, right?
Yeah.
And
Thank you for that, Bonnie.
Yes, and it's on May 15th. So check it out, because it really ties in everything that you're saying. And it's just a pleasure, such a pleasure to actually get to meet you. So thank you.
Thank you. Again, I want you all to, sometimes my grandmother used to say, give people their flowers while they're still above where they grow. Y'all have a real gift in Tim, and somebody who's courageous. And part of what I'm always excited about, and this is going to sound silly, but I'm always excited to hear somebody with a Southern twang have a progressive mind. And that makes a difference. Because, here in the South, people already think about us in some sort of way. And oftentimes people hear you coming before they see you coming. It's like that buck or that turkey. And that's an important thing for all the people that I have known in the National Wildlife Federation, the people who have had, or any state affiliate, the best and most progressive conversations have come from Southerners. Because for some reason, people in other parts of the country, not all, but many either aren't interested, too uncomfortable, or not brave enough to broach it. So I want to commend him for being an ally, and that's something that you get a lot of questions. Well, how am I an ally? How do I, and you have to live that. And it wasn't just a one-time thing in meeting him at one place. Oftentimes, let me tell you, if you've ever been to one of those Wildlife Federation national meetings and you're in a mass of people and you're just milling around, and here I was pretty young at the time. I hardly knew any of these people, and they're just, it's people in cowboy boots worth more than I'm making a month, and people in, all these people, and they sought me out. I will never forget that. I will never forget North Carolina Wildlife Federation for how they embraced me. And that makes a world of difference to anybody, because ultimately this is conservation is about love. It's about caring. It's about how we embrace the world, natural and human. And when you get somebody that stands the test of time, and people overuse that word authentic, but Tim is who Tim is. and I, and so that allows us as human beings to make mistakes. And if we make mistakes, then that means we can learn from them. And if we can learn from the mistakes we make, it means that we go forward in a different way. So I'm grateful for y'all having me in this morning. I'm sorry what happened to NC State happened to NC State last night against Miami. But I am grateful for what you have done in North Carolina to keep this conversation going. That you have done more than just say Black Lives Matter. That it's part of what you have been trying to show. So somebody asked a question the other day of my wife on a call, and they said, well, how can we say that and not be associated with this terrorist organization, which kind of made her really mad. And she said, well, back up a minute. If you just say those three words, what does that mean? Does it mean that your life matter? Or my friend, my student said, no, let's not say God bless the folks in New Orleans who are about to get beat up by this hurricane. Let's say God bless America. Well, America ain't about to get hit by the hurricane. Folks in Lake Charles were about to. So I say all that to say it's not just about three words. It's about living a mission and a vision, and I know that y'all are trying. So thank you for that.
Drew, this is Tim, and you were way too kind. We sought you out, and I sought you out because you're a great human being and a knowledgeable person, and your friendship means a lot to me. You've been wonderful with your time. We're going to use your book, just so you know, to continue this conversation. We're using the book as our continue on. We're very much committed to not checking boxes and one and done. This just like fundraising. This will never end as we build our conservation army and work on inclusion. This never stops. You and I do share something also in common. I also had Oscar Slaughters, and I thought my basketball career was over. It was so freaking painful. But again, as somebody who's so high in demand, we can't thank you enough. And I'm a fairly, unemotional person, gruff, but I will say, you talked about care and love and empathy, and I love you. I look forward. And let me be reciprocal too. Let me make sure that we didn't just call you here to talk to us. When the North Carolina Wildlife Federation can help you and any cause you're involved with, please contact me at any time. We're ready. This doesn't end, but thank you for this open conversation. And again, can't thank you enough, brother. Thank you.
Thank you, man. And when y'all want to talk about the book, have me back in. I love answering questions about the book because, I know my data set.
You better believe it. Thank you. Have a great weekend, brother. Thank you so much.
All right. Y'all too. Love y'all.
Yes, sir. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Drew.
All right.
Thanks, Drew. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording.